Why, hello everyone, and welcome. All right, I'm gonna bring Vlad up here on this. Hey, Vlad, how's it going? Can you
It's
hear me?
great to be with you.
I mean, it's well, I'm honored. I'm honored by your presence here on my Substack live here today, Vlad. And we've been planning this for like a long time, it seems now, and so it's finally come to fruition. We're talking together on Substack Live. And I am I mean, a lot has happened since we like first started discussing doing this. And one of the things that I want everyone to remember in in this moment, right, is that, and I hope to, Glad you're welcome to disagree with me on this, but um, democracy is not it's not a spectator sport, right? I mean, we have to start thinking more about democracy as a verb, not a noun, something that we all do. We need a return to democratic culture. And that is like one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to Vlad today, because I discovered Vlad years ago now, when I was taking a particular interest in the situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And I have come to see Vlad as, I think, one of the most important voices today online in thinking about the democratic crisis, the emergency that we face. Um, and I think you bring a lot of really important insights into the nature of our problem, and also the structure of solutions that we should be moving towards. So that's why I wanted to talk to you today. And so welcome.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Mike. Let's do our best to make sense of what the hell is going on.
So you know, Vlad, I mean, one of the things that you have been very prescient about, right, is this um what you describe as a sort of a tendency towards post-truth populism, that, if I understand your argument correctly, stems from a increasing sense among our democratic polity that there's really no point in participating in politics, because they, as I think, as you said, they feel like they can't touch it, they can't influence it, that democratic participation is of no consequence, and this has allowed this vacuum in the polity to emerge, that is now being relentlessly exploited by what you describe as post-truth populism. Could you like maybe like expand on that?
I think that citizenries in the West are feeling what I think of as four different emotions, and the worst of them is the one that you just touched on. So I'm worried about the first three, which is feeling unsafe, feeling betrayed, feeling powerless. But then the worst of all is this sort of feeling, or rather murky vision, of politics as something inherently opaque. And what's scary about it is that it's actually worse than the feeling that politics is betraying you, or not working for you, or leaving you with no capacity to inflect where it's going, or is just leaving you unsafe because your politicians, are not leaving you in good hands. All of these things are things you could feel are fixable if the game you were looking at still in principle worked. But this feeling, this fourth feeling of opacity, that you can't touch politics, that you can't make sense of politics, that politics is like a set of 7 or 8 sports mixed into one, where you can look at the thing, but you can't make sense of what the rules are. That feeling is very, very toxic, very, very corrosive, because it means you're not giving up on a particular politics, but you're giving up on politics altogether, because it just no longer makes sense. And we have to be honest about who is feeling this. We, in, let us say, non-Trump circles, are very convinced that Trump voters feel this. And it's clear, because Trump is going to make America great again via no possibly existing mechanism of causation. There is no account of how he is going to do X by mechanism Y, and the institutional condition Z, to get the people who vote for him into a better place politically or economically. So Trump voters tendentiously are floating outside of the realm of cause and effect. And we talk about that, but we also have to be realistic about how we ourselves can float in this bubble too, and end up depoliticized, either by relating to politics as a kind of consumer sport. I'm going to log on to a shopping website and buy things that look nice, and things that don't look nice, I have no interest in. The problem with that is that politics isn't a set of consumer goods. You very often have to pick vehicles in politics that you don't like, but they're practically vehicles that could get you closer from A to B. And another thing that is happening, and we have to be honest about this, is that people are despairing. I have a small community on YouTube, and I am finding that people are literally despairing about the state of politics. And they're asking me questions like, not how do we fix this, but how do I stay sane next week with the sort of stuff that's going on? And we have to be honest about that. And here you have to sort of balance gentleness with sobriety, because on the one hand you don't want people entering a fantasy land, but on the other hand you have to empathize with the fact that people's nervous systems are whacked by the political reality around them. And then there is something else, and I just touched on it in a video I released on my main channel about a kind of ideological wash of a global nature that we're all exposed to, of which I argue Putin is only the most extreme manifestation. And the point here is that another way in which we on the non-Trump side can get conspiratorial is by thinking that all our problems are somebody else's fault, that they're external. That if only our democracies were immune from these horrific meanies, these horrific meanie autocrats who are starting wars and behaving really terribly, then we would be okay. And that's very dangerous, because we confuse the 5% Putinist influence on the ex-conservative authoritarian right in the West with a 95% influence. Well, these are 95% homegrown movements. They would be basically identical and intact if Putin and Russia literally vanished and it was some kind of a beautiful forest and set of unpopulated lands with lakes and rivers. So that's another way in which we ourselves are vulnerable to fall into conspiratorial thought. We think this is so bad, it can't be us. It must be to do with certain kinds of external malfeasance, interventions in our democracies that we can block, and then our democracies will restore themselves to a kind of version of normal. So the big animating fantasy there is still a Fukuyamian fantasy of ebb and flow. Yes, we're in a downturn now, but it just keeps going up and down with a general trajectory that is tending toward the perfectibility of human beings and their convergence and some kind of system of global capitalism backed by democratic and liberal institutions. Well, we've stopped believing that at the level of conscious belief, but as an image that still structures how we think. And that means that we can relate to the challenges we face as these kinds of products of foreign interference, which are in fact aberrations, because once we protect ourselves properly from them, our democracies will restore themselves to sanity. That's some of what I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's the thing that like I'm trying to do, whatever this is I'm doing, right? I mean, I left Silicon Valley a year ago, and I've been writing and doing Substack lives, talking to people like you, talking to trying to find a way for myself, right, to contribute to the democratic project. And one of the things that I've really kind of come to realize is that, and I mean, and this isn't really a new insight. It's one that I think was sort of always there for me, but it's like very front and center. And I think you kind of get at when you talk about magical thinking is people's need for certainty. This need for there to be an explanation. This need for there to kind of be a uh, you know like people want tomorrow to look like today, and they're afraid of that uncertainty, and it seems that this is sort of like the psychological nexus that demagoguery in general like exploits. It's also part of the problem with why technocratic liberalism has been so catastrophic, and has left, I think, an entire generation of liberal politicians unable to navigate this moment because they lost touch with the fact that like there is this thing in human psychology that has to be wrangled with. You have to make people, you have to find ways to make people comfortable with uncertainty at some level, and to welcome change, and to build narratives around that. And I and I wonder like I think I wonder like what your like response is like to that, because I think you talk about this a lot.
Well, I mean, just look at us. I think looking at this stream, it looks like there's a couple of animals here that are fairly complex animals. They have a particular psychology that has a certain shape, has a certain depth. And it's a feature of that psychology. There are certain things we don't like. Often that varies enormously by culture. But actually, what you named doesn't. People today and people in ancient Greece did not like uncertainty, did not like the feeling that stuff wasn't fairly firm under their feet. Now, there is cultural variation here, and we are modern humans, and we live in a disenchanted world, and a world where certain forms of cosmic purposiveness have disappeared. That's not to say we're becoming secular. That's to say that even religious people in our culture are more secular than any religious people who have lived before. So I think that there are some general features of our world that might make us feel unsafe and uncertain and at home that have very little to do with the kind of politics specifically that we have. But then that can't be it. I mean, that's just going to be something that sort of shadows the situation, but that's not going to give us the main answer. Historically, one way of looking for the main answer, if you're going to do it cartoonishly, is to say that a certain project of globalization happened about which people feel two things. One is they weren't asked about it. And the second thing is that it made them feel like their countries didn't matter. It made them feel like it wasn't clear where their countries ended and where their countries began, and that their countries sort of washed up in a kind of a global storm of globalized forces. And that created an enormous feeling of lack of control. Because it's not just that you don't control your political levers you can pull as a citizen. It turns out that the levers you pull then lead to politicians who themselves don't control anything, because your country is just sort of awash in a globalized world in which your political representatives are often relatively powerless dummies too, doing their best, but operating under enormous constraints. And so that feeling, I think, is coming back to haunt us. We've been aware of it for a while, and it's very much behind the enormous concerns people have about immigration and the enormous concerns people have about the borders of their country being secure. There is a tendency to dismiss this feeling among citizens as a combination of racism and ignorance and selfishness, but it actually stems from a deep sense that you have to feel about your country in a way that's at least a little bit analogous to a house, where you have some control over how far the doors and the windows are open and so on. And so people have developed enormous anxiety about the issue of immigration, which might be blended with racism and intolerance and so on, but that doesn't make the issue superficial. And that's largely a product of this feeling people have that they're just sort of being washed up by globalized forces that their country can't control. There's a kind of a double feeling of powerlessness. I can't control my political representatives, and they can't control the world. And so, or they're corrupted by forces they can't control, and so on. So I'm very worried about that. And we have to cut deep when we talk about what we can do about it, because some of this is still stuff we can't control. Some of the rest of it is stuff we can begin to recover from in the context of our domestic polities by emphasizing the homeliness and the importance of our domestic polities and the relevant values of solidarity and the public good. So I think that I've said two things. One is just that people feel alienated in the modern world. And the second is that there's a very special precarity and there's a very special sense of uncertainty that's to do with the way people feel they have been sort of victimized in a powerless way by the forces of globalization.
Yeah, the immigration thing is interesting to me, right? I mean, going into the last election here in America, I think there was a realization among the Democratic establishment, and you saw this with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, sort of, basically taking more of a position that they did need to crack down on the border while trying to thread this needle around legal immigration. But one of the things we've really seen among American public opinion in the past few months, which seems very different than what we see in the UK and in Western Europe, is Americans have really recoiled from Donald Trump's immigration policy. We're now seeing multiple high quality polls showing over 70% of Americans responding to questions like, is immigration is good for the country, right? There's like Gallup polls out and showing this, a dramatic recoil against this immigration crackdown. Donald Trump's immigration crackdown now has like this, it's like in the 30 something percent support among the public. So there's something different about American culture when it comes to even this problem of like mass migration. You're even starting to see, you're seeing this in rural communities in America today. Farmers now are starting to get quite upset about the farm laborers being deported, and so it's even it's even starting to create consternation within MAGA here. I'm curious, what you think about that. Is there a difference? There seems to be something really culturally different about the American conversation about immigration and the European conversation about immigration.
I think that there is such a thing as a tough and inevitably cruel immigration policy. And that's simply because in most Western countries, reckoning with what people feel on the doorstep is probably not compatible with an immigration policy that takes human rights seriously and that takes the avoidance of cruelty and humiliation seriously. I have some solutions to this. I don't think we can any longer frame the immigration issue in terms of human rights. I think we should frame it in terms of people at home welcoming others into their home on their terms, so they don't feel that sort of alien principles are imposed on them, that people come in and then you're told to shut up because there's some kind of human rights based or utilitarian principle you have to adhere to. But there's a difference between a pretty tough and unlovely immigration policy and a handling of the issue of immigration that is authoritarian and arbitrarily authoritarian. So I think that it's impossible to decouple the two. Trump is engaged in his antics around immigration as part of a package of an authoritarian turn that feels like that palpably to a lot of Americans. They might want to normalize it, but I think a lot of Americans are feeling that this is, the country entering waters that are not right, that are not familiar. So that's one thought. I want to say that Trump's immigration antics come as part and parcel of a bigger authoritarian turn. I think one difference between the United States and Europe is that, contrary to the epic degree of racially based structured disadvantage in the United States is less racist than Europe. We're just more racist than you. In particular, we have much more visceral degrees of what I would call aesthetic racism. And that's to say, people who might in principle think it's all jolly good that we're all here and we all mix together, whether we've come from the Caribbean or from Vietnam, or whether our parents have come from there. But though one might adhere to that in sort of political principle, aesthetically it doesn't quite feel right to one. There's a lot more of that in Europe, to the point that personally I actually greatly enjoy this quality of a complete absence of aesthetic racism in people, because it's not guaranteed. It's actually not guaranteed in Europe. Now, I am sitting in a very, very multicultural city in London, and so in London, it's gonna be easier to find people who feel no aesthetic racism. But if you go further out in the country, that's certainly going to be there. And I don't want to over condemn people about it. It's a fairly natural product of various kinds of forms of historical life, community homogeneities, and so on. That's another difference. But broadly speaking, I hear you. I recognize what you're talking about, but at the same time, I probably wouldn't, but I think neither would you, take this as far as saying that we can sort of rebound back to an immigration conversation 20 years ago. I think people are more concerned than before in the United States about whether their country is a country, whether their border is secure, and concerned especially about this distinction between people who are in the country legally and people who are in the country illegally. What we should say at this point is that it's of the nature of authoritarian politics to make distinctions and then to make them sort of leak. And so what the Trump administration is doing is making distinctions between different kinds of people in the country in a way that sort of is got a perpetual spill to it. You pick on one form of outsider first, then you pick on slightly less outsiders, and eventually you end up picking on citizens directly. So that's a trend we have to be very worried about, because Trump is an exclusionary authoritarian populist. But I still think that we have to take very seriously this general sense that people have, that they need to feel secure about the border. They need to feel secure that the people who are coming in are people who they're choosing to come in, and so on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think another aspect too, right, is that you take a sort of a symbol, American symbol, like the Statue of Liberty, which is in fact, like, it's associated with this idea that America welcomes immigrants, right? It's sort of crazy to think that, Ronald Reagan's parting message that he gave from the Oval Office when he left office after the election of George H.W. Bush was again one of celebrating the fact that America is a nation of immigrants, and it's interesting that that used to, at least in the middle of the 20th century, um, uh, was actually very much associated with conservative politics in America, and so there does seem to be like a deep cultural thread, and I do think you are sort of seeing that now, right? Like that some of that like reemerge, and it might have something to do with the sort of the differences in racial politics between Europe and America.
But two footnotes quickly. I think that polarization inevitably makes this worse. It inevitably makes people anxious about the border if they are in a very polarized relationship with fellow citizens, and loss of trust in institutions as well. If you trust your institutions, and if you share in a common sense of fairness with citizens who are opposed to you, you can be much more relaxed about the border. But sort of persecutory anxiety or legitimate concern about the border is inevitably going to be great if you've got polarization and loss of trust in institutions.
One thing I want to also sort of double click on is really, I wrote a piece. I'm not sure if you read it, but I wrote a piece on about, my thoughts on cancel culture, especially in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, and what we are currently seeing unfold here in the United States. I tried to write the piece very carefully, to not make it seem like it was victim blaming, or pointing the blame at the left. But I do think it does need to be said that I think what you characterize as like hyper identity politics, this what some people might call liberal excess sometimes. I think in the American political conversation, I think it's often characterized that way. I actually tried to not make it a moral argument around whether or not like liberal cancel culture or identity politics related cancel culture was morally wrong, and not even that, and not even that it was like ineffective, but it actually did something even more dangerous. Is it left, I think, the political class without the muscle of like argument and persuasion. They got way too used to using the strategies of, you can call it deplatforming or canceling, dogpiling, all of these sorts of tactics. What they were actually doing wasn't just wasn't harming other people per se, but they were robbing themselves of what would become a very necessary skill in this moment. and I see this a lot in people who I talk to privately, like politically engaged people. Like they're just like, well, what do we do? Like we like there like MAGA controls the media. Like it doesn't occur to them that that it's their job to persuade people, right? And in fact, this was such, I think, a you know a psychological trap that they had set for themselves, that it was common to hear things like, it's not my job to convince you, or you need to go and educate yourself. If I have to explain to you why this is transphobic or sexist or homophobic, then you clearly like need to go educate yourself, because it's not my job to explain to you why it's that. That to me was not like I'm not making a moral judgment of that stance. I'm making the observation that that was actually a form of intellectual laziness that left an entire political class unable to now deal with this moment. I'm so curious how you might react to my observation.
I agree. I think that we have a crisis, even at the level of our very best universities, of pushing young people out into the culture who no longer have the capacity that they did have. And I'm reluctant to do nostalgic romanticization of the past, but this is true. Young people today coming out of Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge or Princeton are less adept at engaging in conflict constructively than they were 20 years ago, because there is a tendency to think that conflict should just go away if the other side wises up. So there is a kind of giving up on the political in politics, which immediately teaches you that you don't get to choose who you share the table of politics with, and that you'd better damn well sit at that table of politics, and you can only leave unless really extreme things begin happening. And then even then you might need to fight back. And I think that one of the deleterious consequences of what I call hyper-identity politics has been that a lot of people in the liberal center and on the center left, the woke liberal center and the woke center, the woke center left, have begun proceeding as though politics was an intellectual argument. And if you were on the right side of the argument, you didn't need to do much, because you're just right and the other people are just wrong. Ideally, the other people should just be replaced by more rational and less prejudiced versions of themselves. Well, as that doesn't seem to be happening, we can just sort of abuse them and wait. Caricaturally, of course, I'm putting this, but there's a significant element of truth to this cartoon, because it's of the essence of hyper-identity politics to take political disagreement and heavily moralize it. If you and I disagree about taxation 20 years ago, we might say, well, Mike thinks that's going to be the consequence for the economy. I have a slightly different expectation of what the consequences are going to be, and we can have a beer and sort of deal with our disagreement, maybe by agreeing to see things differently. But we're not moralizing this. But if you and I then think that we are better people because of this difference on taxation policy, and that our disagreement about taxation policy is a core property of who we are morally, we're in trouble. And then it gets even worse, because we then go on, which is what hyper-identity politics does, and conceive of moral disagreement completely in terms of identity. That's even worse, because imagine you and I are already having a moral disagreement, and I think this disagreement does go to the core of who we are. I can at least tell you, well, maybe this disagreement is about different character traits that we have that are distinctively our own. Some of them can evolve. Maybe we can both evolve a bit if we keep talking. But we don't make it about character. We make it about identity, which is very, very fixed. It means straight away disagreement, attack on me. Disagreement, attack on me. Disagreement is basically a way of the other side trying to disappear me, because my position politically is also my moral stance, and my moral stance is my identity. And in the context of modern conversations about violence, which sort of blend sticks and stones violence with the violence of language, which I don't believe in generally, unless it's a provocation of sticks and stones behavior intentionally. The problem with that then is that we go from our disagreement being political to being moral, from being moral to being about identity, and from being about identity to being about survival. Because if you disagree with me, you're basically not seeing me, and on a loose conception of the notion of violence, you're actually just eliminating me. So there's something genocidal about the very nature of elementary political disagreement that shouldn't even raise our temperature. But we are genuinely positioning it in the realm of genocide. You are erasing me. You are erasing the group that I belong to if you disagree. And that's just not how politics works unless you have a society of 8 people in the forest who all happen to agree with one another. And what then went on to happen is that this was partly imposed on academic and media institutions, which were expected to take sides in political conflict and pronounce that one side is the morally correct side, is the side that expresses the correct type of identity, and the kind of identity that my institution now needs to inculcate in its current members and in its future members. So what is this? This is not left-wing politics. There's very little Marxism here because there's no class here. It's a sort of very strange, professionalized elite behavior that's partly about getting an advance in your professional world, and has very little to do with sort of tangible positive consequences for genuinely disadvantaged people out there in society, which is why the most vocal voices of wokeism are typically very privileged voices that have prestigious degrees and so on. This was a very serious bad turn, and I call it a bad turn within liberalism. I don't think this is a left-wing phenomenon, largely because what's driving this is a kind of deformation of the values of sort of liberal inclusion and so on. And so that's proved very dangerous because it's created an authoritarian counterwave that is much more dangerous than wokeism itself ever was. But that wave has been exacerbated by our woke excesses.
Yeah. So I want to so you say it's like a liberal, it's a liberal phenomenon. And the thing I want to push, I half agree with you on that in the sense that it's like it kind of comes out, I think, of sort of this the liberal political culture, this blob that of sort of this elite. But I would push back a little bit and question whether or not it can claim to be liberal for the reason that I think a really important feature of qualifying, a sort of an ideological stance as liberal is one of some degree of epistemic humility, some degree of believing that there isn't some singular conception of the good life, that one must be open to the idea that that all stances, all sort of moral stances are sort of like provisional at some level, right? Like beyond sort of like the basics of human dignity. And so, I mean, is it like I would go so far as to say those manifestations moved into the illiberal territory. So, like, I mean, So how do I mean? How do you like?
Extremely illiberal. It's very illiberal to moralize political difference. It's very illiberal to make moral conflict a matter of identity, and it's very illiberal to insert certain expectations actually into institutional bureaucracies so that they take sides with particular identities. At the level of how liberal or illiberal this is, this stuff reeks of Soviet politics. But the point is, where does it come from? What's gone wrong? Is this, on the one hand, a set of left-wing ideological materials that are structuring this, or is this a kind of narcissistic and distorted authenticity-based deformation of liberal principles of inclusion taken to their limit and turned into their opposite? The history is, or rather the sociology, is more of that kind rather than of the kind that's about sub-Marxist ideas being inserted there. And also look at the biggest proponents of this stuff. These are often highly educated, privileged people. And then look at the economic consequences of this stuff, whereby wokeism was compatibilized with a certain form of capitalism that is arguably not friendly to disadvantaged groups. So I couldn't agree with you more. It's as illiberal as anything we had seen in the recent history of the West until the post-conservative authoritarian turn that we're seeing now, which is in part a reaction to wokeism, would have come along anyway. So I'm not one of those people who says, "Oh, you woke guys, you screwed up, and now here are the consequences." I think there's a 20% impact there, but I think this wave of an authoritarian kind would have come anyway. If I were to challenge myself and say, "Well, Vlad, there are some non-liberal sources to this form of gross illiberalism. It's not just a kind of a liberalism in reverse, as I like to call it." The argument I'd probably make is that there is also a postmodern element to it, whereby truth is what you decide it to be. And that arguably originates from certain kinds of French influences post-World War II, that you could make the case for being leftist, even though that's not very persuasive. But you could have a conversation about perhaps Foucault in this dimension, who's a very serious thinker in many ways. So I think that there is a little bit of a sort of a postmodern relativism there. And to tell the story of how that's left, you would need to tell a story about how French intellectual culture reckoned with the realities of the Soviet Union, responded to it by first of all denying that reality, then partly accepting it, and sort of. You need to tell that very long story. So you could get something out of that. I don't just want to cancel that direction, but I think fundamentally this is a kind of a very sick form of hyperactivity of liberal values that then turns liberal values into their very opposite.
Yeah, I mean, this comes up a lot, right? Like on the sort of the right sort of critique of like liberal thought, right? This critique of the hyper relativism, of sort of continentalist sort of philosophy, Jacques Derrida. You mentioned like Foucault. I have actually for a long time thought, and I'm actually somewhat partial to a lot of the interventions that the postmodernist school has, right? I mean, I think it's quite clear, right, that everything we sort of think about in our social realm is sort of socially constructed, right? I'm a public intellectual like Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote the sort of the popular trade book *Sapiens*, he kind of makes this point that like we kind of like made everything up, right? Like we made it all up, right? Like I mean, like everything, like the lines we drew on maps to demarcate borders between countries, the side of the road that we drive on, you drive on a different side of the road than we do here in the UK, is that there is some truth to that, but like I don't think that one must lose themselves in nihilistic relativism to take on board those observations about the world, right? Like I'm kind of like partial, I'm kind of partial to say like AJ Ayers, right? Like sort of the emotivist sort of stance, sort of and combined with sort of with sort of this observation about sort of the nature of our social reality. And I don't think that you have to accept, right, a complete evacuation of shared meaning to take on board those insights. And that's actually where I find, I think, a lot of this identitarian this left-wing identitarianism or hyper identity politics. I don't even think it's like coherent on its own terms, like really, like if you start to like think about these things more carefully.
I think that thinking it makes it so, which is what we're talking about, is true in some respects, not true in others, and true but not in the way we'd expect in yet other cases. So if I get out, we don't use cash money anymore. If I get out a note that says £10 on it, that's going to be utterly useless in a society where the institution of money is absent. I can write all the checks I want. I can make all kinds of bank transfer type gestures. If I'm in a society where the institution of money doesn't exist, I'm just going through the motions. I might as well just do star jumps instead. Now, that doesn't mean that you and I can't tell the difference between $20 and $10. I mean, the two thoughts are completely consistent. So some things are partly a product of what we take them to be. Others are less so. I mean, human beings have a certain kind of psychology, for example, which is culturally expressed in different ways under different circumstances, but it also has a lot of universal features that we perennially see coming out in political life, for example. And thinking something about what human psychology is does not make it true about human psychology. I mean, I can sit here and say that I feel that human beings are not in any way predatory. Well, that's not going to change the fact of whether we are or we aren't predators. We're predators with a moral conscience. Our moral conscience structures the way we organize our predation, let's say. But even if that account is false and we are predators without a moral conscience, or moral conscience means that we're not predators, there is a truth about the matter there. Just me saying things about it isn't going to change the reality of it. So a lot of social constructs are constrained to go in a certain direction because there are universal features of human nature and universal features of human psychology. So all social life is a social construct in one respect or another, but a heck of a lot of social life inevitably had to go the way it went because of the kind of animals that we are. And so that's not relativist. A lot of the things that are social constructs aren't very relative at all. They wouldn't be there if there were no human beings there. Well, but so what?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's contingencies, right, about our existence, right? Our biology, our genes, the behavioral tendencies that those genes like imbue into our psychology, like the environment in which we live. I just take the position that that you can take on board the notion that there's a certain there is an arbitrariness to a lot of our social reality in like if you're trying to like look at it from the view from nowhere, right? But that doesn't mean that it's that those things don't matter, like, to most humans. I think I think these things can be. I think you can hold both of these ideas at once without collapsing into nihilism. And I kind of get quite frustrated by the sort of the scientisms, like, complete like disapprobation for even like taking on board the notion of things like the socially constructed nature of our reality, and then vice versa, this sort of this hyper sort of relativism that hangs on this observation but doesn't sort of acknowledge the sort of like contingencies that you talk about.
Yeah, epistemically, Richard Dawkins and Jacques Derrida are in the same camp insofar as both don't see much of a distinction between scientific understanding and other forms of understanding. They fail to see the distinction for different reasons, but there's a very interesting marriage here between postmodernism or post-structuralism and scientism, namely that neither care to very seriously distinguish scientific explanation from other modes of explanation that are not reducible to scientific explanation. So as ever, we've got these two polarized camps in our culture competing and clashing, and they're going on lecture tours criticizing each other, but they're actually saying the wrong thing and the exactly same wrong thing, namely that explanation of human life is sort of a wash, it's sort of continuous, and we don't need to make sharp distinctions between scientific explanation and social explanation. For Dawkins, that's because scientific explanation will eventually take over social explanation. For some of the postmodernists, it's because there is no such thing as a special mode of scientific explanation that's really any better than what you're going to get in a sociology department. And I think that's just false. Physics tells us much more about the world than postmodernist sociology tells us about physics. I've stolen that from somebody, but that's okay.
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, the way that I talk about this with people, right, and this maybe will take us to another dark topic, right, which is this tech right that was really my raison d'etre for now, doing what I'm doing. It was the sort of thing that woke me up to the sort of threat. And I think scientism, by the way, I would put sort of Elon Musk and a lot of these venture capitalists sort of in that sort of scientism, technological determinism type like mode of thought, right? And the way that I've sort of try to challenge it in an approachable way, in ways that people might understand, is that like it's not about like, can we build a giant rocket that will take us to Mars? We certainly can. Like, the question is, like, should we do that? And why should we do that rather than make sure, all the children in Africa and are fed? And it's not like we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Like, maybe we can do both. But that, like, technology is like ultimately instrumental to, I mean, as Hume would say, right? Like, reason is and ought to always be a slave of the passions, right? Like, that's like the error, I think, of scientism and technologically determinist thinking. It never stops to ask the question, like, why are we doing this? I think in pop culture too, like in the movie Jurassic Park, Jeff Goldblum's character has this relatively memorable line where he basically says that, like, all of you scientists, you've been asking yourselves the question, if you could, you never stop to ask yourself if you should. And I think that's actually like, a a type of thinking that like I don't really hear talked enough about, I think, in more sort of like highbrow conversations around this sort of scientism, technological determinism type thinking that is very common in Silicon Valley. I think is very, very prevalent in Elon Musk's thoughts. And sort of just curious to hear your response to that.
I think there's a tendency, and it is a scientific tendency, to want a deliverance from politics via technology. And the feeling often is that, yes, we haven't experienced that so far, but if our technology gets really, really, really good, then we can begin transcending politics. But the problem is that no matter how technologically sophisticated what you do is, politics can turn off the lights on it. All the same conditions of political life that apply here in 2025 on Earth would apply 300 years from now on Mars. There's going to be no transcendence of that. That Mars project, if we had to give it the space of treating as a potential reality for a moment, could tumble the way human societies tumble in the past, could be brought down the way political arrangements were brought down by revolutions. There is nothing that technology can do that's going to transcend political contingency. And much the same goes for this fantasy of deliverance from mortality. You're going to freeze yourself in some way. Well, what's going to happen to what remains of you in 300 years from now? Is the same company that put you into this condition even going to exist? What are going to be the political conditions out there? So you can never get guarantees against political contingency, and politics can never transcend political contingency. No matter how clever a rocket you make, somebody could, turn the plug off on it in some sense. And so there is no transcendence of that kind. There is a spinning out of control that we could get with AI technologically, but there is no way that technology can transcend the reality of politics. And so Mars, if we had to give it the space of taking the notion seriously for a moment, would be as shitty and more shitty, likely, version of the political challenges we face here on Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Vlad, I mean, we've been geeking out on some philosophy here a little bit. I wanted to maybe like turn towards the future a little bit, right? You give this, and by the way, if you're, if please let me know if like you're short on time or I'm.
We can go more.
Okay. Turning towards the future. I mean, use this analogy that I really like about democracy sort of being this ship that was in the bay that's now heading out into open waters. And you've really tried to like frame frame this sort of, I guess, you're trying to get people psychologically comfortable with the idea that we're going to be rocking back and forth in stormy seas for some time. And I think that that's like a really hard thing for people to hear, that as bad as things seem right now, that people need to get ready for things to be quite a bit worse. But you also sort of, take the position that like we have to sort of be okay with that we're going to survive. That is bad as that sounds, this is survivable. And I get a lot of feedback sometimes, from my writing, and I do try to be optimistic in my stance, because I do understand like that this is scary for people, and this can kind of really be like a hard thing for people to hear, and the worry you sometimes have about trying to be realistic about this is it will it will lead to more depoliticization. So like how do you think we like how do you thread the needle on that kind of like realism?
By trying to reset people's expectations from the recent past to the past more generally. We are heading into quite unlovely territory relative to where we were in the West, 1989 till 2014, roughly speaking. We're not heading into the kind of disastrous territory that Germans inherited in Europe in the middle 1940s. So understand that humans have been through a lot of shit, and humans have been through much bigger shit than the shit that's going to happen to us over the next 20 years in the West. But if you absolutely can't imagine a situation where your democracy deteriorates over time, then that's an extremely difficult thing for you to admit. It's a very difficult thing for you to bear. And a lot of this ebb and flow Fukuyamianism that still persists is actually a consequence of people not being able to bear the fact that the future won't be like the recent past. So you reset and you focus on the courage, the hopefulness, and the dignity of previous generations in the West who went through a lot of crap, including 2 world wars. So that's one thought I have. A second thought I have, obviously, is that it is up to us to a degree. There are limits. There are senses in which we're stuck where we are. We're stuck with the historical tendencies before us, but we can inflect these tendencies. And a 1% inflection of a tendency has palpable consequences. And I say exactly the same whatever policy we're talking about. If we're just talking about generally keeping our democratic institutions intact enough so they don't completely crumble, well, being 1% closer to them being intact is always a better scenario. The same on defense policy, the same on climate. A 1% improvement in our climate policy is going to have positive consequences, not just for us, but for some people around the world who might not lose their livelihoods or might not experience climate-mediated war or famine or societal collapse. So the 1% point really, really matters. Like, it makes an actual difference if things are 1% worse or 1% better to a large number of people, millions of people. And then I think that we also just have to give people time. I mean, there are sort of stages of grief here, and you don't want to sort of coerce somebody into an acceptance that they're not ready for. Rather, what I try to do, especially on my chat channel, where it's less important what I say, it's more important that we just turn up there and sort of go over the state of politics together. There's a kind of a ritualistic quality there. And part of the point of that, and part of the point of doing it in such a way that is also sort of spectacularly dead in the algorithm, because it's the same people coming back to discuss the same thing over and over and over. Part of the point of that is that you are engaging with people's capacity to balance acceptance with the refusal to accept. So you have to meet people where they are, but rather than telling them, for goodness sake, don't be an infant, accept political reality, you have to encourage them to dance with acceptance and refusal to accept. And we have to be honest here that I think for a lot of people, it is genuinely hard to accept that Trump is worse than just a very bad president who is a kind of aberration after which things can sort of go back to normal. This is hard for some people to accept. It's easy for others.
Yeah.
But it's hard for some. And it partly depends on your culture. It partly depends on your relationship with politics. It partly depends on the nature of sort of your love for politics or your suspicion of it. I mean, one of the central text in the history of the West comes from Thucydides. And in that text, he discusses a situation where there is a series of wars and a 30% fatality rate pandemic going on at the same time. Now that's bloody tough, and that's real. That's not made up. That roughly actually happened. So that teaches us that we probably, on balance, given enough time, will be able to adapt to the difficulties we're going to face. But we need time. I mean, I genuinely think there's a lot of very sophisticated people who are simply not ready to accept what's happening, and that's okay. But we just need to be constructive with them over the next 2 or 3 or 5 years, and so help them dance with themselves about it in a better way. And then the two reassuring things I say on top of all of this is, first of all, in the West, no matter what we say about the state of the climate or the state of our democratic institutions, we're not heading for societal collapse. Belgium is not going to be in societal collapse 25 years from now. It might be in democratic collapse, which is terrible, but that's not societal collapse. So you're not going to be in some kind of apocalypse scenario. You're going to be in a situation, if things go badly, where you can't vote your government out and you can't say what you want to say in public. But you can still go to the theater, you can hear a Mozart opera, and you can eat in a Michelin star restaurant. So let's get a sense of proportion here.
I mean, societies like that exist today, right? I mean,
Hungary.
Look at or even the United Arab Emirates, or
on a different
Qatar,
scale
right?
of repression. Yeah. So what we're heading for is not going to be an ultimate catastrophe. It's not societal collapse. We're heading for a very heavy risk of democratic collapse. So the United States will be a rich and powerful, illiberal society 20 years from now, worst case scenario. So what are the chances that the United States will experience a civil war leading to societal collapse across significant parts of the country? Low. Civil war type conflict is possible, but societal collapse is a very, very low probability outcome. I don't think you should wake up worrying about it. But you could lose your democracy. What are the chances that you're going to lose it in America? 50-50? I would say the way things are going, probably maybe even 70-30. There's a 70% chance of democratic collapse in the United States in the next 20 years, whereby you simply cannot get the guys in power out of power.
70%. 70% is
so.
where you would put the rest. Wow.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Can we double click on that? Okay. What the reasons why you come up with that probability? That's a
because
scarily
that's what
high
will
probability.
happen. That is what will happen unless there's a very significant and effective political counter project by the Democrats or by whatever comes of the Democrats if they collapse. Unless that's done, we are basically degrading US institutions year by year by year by year. And at some point, they're just not going to give resistance. Like, you're lucky that you're not Israel. There's no single button you can press where the whole system collapses. You have a complete sort of forest of institutional complexity, but it's degrading. It's already degraded at an accelerated rate during the first few months of the Trump administration. But I'm sorry, but speaking to Belarusians, for instance, what are their chances of getting rid of Lukashenko over the next few years? Like 1%? 30 to 50% chance is a lot. And if you act, you can make that 90%. The reason why I'm saying it's more likely than not to go badly is that we aren't yet seeing a capacity for an effective counter project that supports institutions. If that happens, I think its chances of simply sort of reversing democratic decline are obviously zero, because it's caused by social forces we can't entirely control. But its chances of halting it short of institutional collapse are very high. So first of all, it's a coin toss.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a coin toss about democratic collapse, not societal collapse. You're not going to be running around zombie style trying to feed yourself in a lawless environment. Just democratic collapse is what's on the table. And then it's democratic collapse that, if you do absolutely nothing effective to counter it, is still not inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
You still got a 30-50% chance of avoiding it. And if you concoct an effective political project to counter it, you're probably going to avoid democratic collapse. And I think that the key challenge for Western democracies is to bring it about that they stay democracies 20, 30 years from now. And I feel that's a very realistic aim for every democracy. But if we are shocked by the kind of thing that I am saying, then we're still not quite grasping the nature of the historical tendency we're facing and the fact that people will be exploiting it. And unless we oppose them effectively, we're going to lose.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that, roughly speaking, we're in a coin toss situation, which, if you take it globally across the West, you could say realistically we will keep some democracies and lose others over the next 20, 30 years. And so the question is, which country do you want yours to be? Do you want your country to be one of the ones that loses their democracy, or do you want your country to be in the group of the 50% or however more, hopefully 70, 80% that manage to keep their democracy over the next quarter century? So that's the fork in the road. It's bad. It's not catastrophic. It's bad. And we still have power over this. It's just that a lot of things are against us.
So, I mean, well, I hope you're wrong about those
Oh, me too.
probabilities as an
I'm
American.
desperate to be wrong. I hope I'm wildly delusional here. I hope I'm on mushrooms about this. Absolutely.
Well, if you want, I mean, well, if you want, so I mean, another perspective that I've seen advanced recently is by the historian and public intellectual Heather Cox Richardson in the United States. She's a historian on American political history. Maybe like, I mean, maybe the most effective public intellectual on American history, and being able to tell that story than anyone I've encountered. And she's made the observation that where we are today in America, with oligarchs essentially in control of the government, is actually a place we've been before. And she points to the late 1800s, the late 19th century in America, where a majority of Congress were essentially like working for the robber barons. They were literally on the payroll. You know, the president was bought off. It was a complete, like, it was a complete capture of government by private business interests, and that all ended up collapsing. You know, and there was, you know, we had the Progressive era and the New Deal that somehow just washed that all away, and we had the trust busting era and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and that had essentially become the oligarch ruling class of America were swept away in a populist liberal uprising that you know that was sort of really built around Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal era. So, and she has even argued that the capture of institutions then was actually somewhat more advanced and worse than even it is now. So I'm curious, like, do you think, like, did we just like get lucky there, or is there something about the deep institutions in America, the subsidiarity governments that we have, the state governments and the local governments that go really deep here, that provides enough democratic possibility to push back even under these conditions?
They weren't the same forces undermining social trust then. Here we talk about the state of the social media, the state of the internet. We do talk about various forms of economic exclusion. we talk about various ideologies of self-realization that are prevalent in our hyper-individualized sort of fake authenticity-driven culture that mitigate against patriotic messages based on solidarity. And we have got various kinds of atomization and untethering of social bonds, whereby people no longer feel they share a society with one another. These social forces make decent levels of social trust impossible. You improve these social forces, more social trust becomes possible. But our control over these social forces is at best partial. And there's also a paradox here. The kind of politics that we need to tackle the breakdown in social trust requires social trust to get actually voted in and to win power. That's a very, very difficult, thorny dilemma that I think our political representatives also need to reckon with, and that could be a learning curve. But I just think that we do not have the same resources of social trust that were available for New Deal liberalism. So trying to get off our version of a sort of liberatory political project that sort of restores social trust off the ground is dependent on the level of social trust the social forces out there that's objective to a degree will just not let us generate. So I think we're operating under very, very big constraints. It's very important not to see the problems we're facing as about ideological conflict. So if you change people's minds and your politics can restore itself, it's mostly not about that. It's mostly about various kinds of social and economic conditions. And unless these change, social trust is screwed. Now, we can change them to some degree and improve social trust. And then in other respects, it's impossible. And then there are a lot of things that are difficult to change. I mean, the regulation of social media is a very good example. It's something that we probably should do, but we don't know how to even begin thinking about doing it. So a lot of these challenges are about tasks that are not impossible but extremely difficult. So for me, social forces improve, social trust goes up. Social forces don't improve, social trust doesn't go up, and then it's going to be very difficult to get over the line any kind of big national project. But we can do a lot to help. I mean, certainly at the level of discourse, it's easy to do things that help. At the level of discourse, we need patriotism and solidarity. So we need to tie anything you want to advocate for, not to difference between one citizen and another, but what all citizens share in common. And we also need to advocate for disadvantaged people, structurally disadvantaged people, not in terms of their unalikeness vis-a-vis everybody else, but in terms of them actually being citizens like everybody else, and in virtue of that, needing a little bit of political and economic attention to make their circumstances more congenial to leading a life with opportunities. So plenty of things we can do at the level of discourse help. Something else that I think there's a lot of room for is what I would call a kind of an inclusive pro-institutional populism, not to endorse the particular policies of, let's say, Mamdani or Sanders, but they're both practitioners of inclusive populist rhetoric that is not anti-institutional. You can take that rhetoric in all kinds of directions and use it constructively. So we can do quite a bit. We can then explore issues of economic democratization. It's hard, but we've got to put them on the table centrally, because people just no longer feel they share the same society. Somebody at the bottom of a company or an organization often feels they're not in the same world as people at the top, not just because of the degree of inequality, but because they don't share a social world. They don't go to the same places on the weekends. They don't experience the same cultural items. They're not in the park together. They're not in the cinema together. So there's a lot to think about there. I'm rambling all over the place because it's a multifaceted situation. But you can do a lot about a lot of it, but with some of it we're just stuck, and therefore there's a limit to how far we can sort of simply recreate the sort of liberatory transformations of the past. To an extent it's possible. To an extent it's like pulling ourselves out of a lake by trying to hold our hair and tug it up into the sky. Well, that's not going to help. We're going to stay in the water.
Yeah, I mean the social media factor, which I think is, I mean, and I it's actually been good to see. I don't know how closely you're following it, but the Utah governor Spencer Cox has, I think, really kind of successfully ignited a conversation that we're now starting to see happen among talking heads in a way that we haven't seen before. This acknowledgement that social media are like, it's like nicotine, it's like cigarettes, like and it does seem to me that I mean, that regulation of social media is something we need to figure out how to do. But like you said, it's hard to think. I mean, as a liberal, it's like hard for me to think about, because you don't want, especially here in America. I mean, with our First Amendment culture, it's hard to think about how do you regulate something like social media without the government getting involved or having the power to regulate content. And so there seems to be like a can't get there from here scenario when trying to think about this. And I don't think we're going to solve that now, because it's a really hard problem.
Often the answer is new institutions. So obviously I'm not saying that's the answer, but I'm saying that the space in which the conversation for an answer would be e-courts, a part of a legal system that just deals with deals with this world. But some kind of institutional supplementation is inevitable if we're gonna even talk about doing it, and that of course is always incredibly hard.
Well, there's like, I think one place for that, like, I think that is a potential for regulation is around algorithmic content, and the fact that these companies make money by driving engagement and outrage, and potentially going after that as a business, banning that as a business model rather than actually banning content. Seems like a potential low-hanging fruit there.
Algorithms have to be transparent, and there has to be some democratic oversight over them, quite frankly, if we're going to keep our democracies.
Yeah. I think so. For maybe I left I just one more time check on you.
We're good.
Okay. Yeah, to take this to a place, where the reason I found you, the conversation around the war in Ukraine. I think I've been in this conversation for a while. I mean, I'm quite passionate about the need to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty, and to resist this war of aggression that Russia has brought upon the Ukrainians. And we are now starting to see Russia test boundaries. We just saw once again the incursion into NATO airspace, Russian jets today. I mean, it seems to me very clearly that Putin is now testing boundaries in a very, very dangerous way that risks escalation. And I wanted to, get your sort of contemporaneous perspective on like where we now sit, and your perspective on like what Putin's aims are here, and how he's sort of like viewing the situation in the United States and in the broader West.
Putin's theory of victory over us is democratic collapse in the West, more than any kind of military victory. He doesn't want a military conflict with the West. So the prospect of some kind of military confrontation between Russia and NATO in the future is all about political outcomes for Putin, and actually the avoidance of anything remotely resembling a full-scale conflict. So if there is something that we are on course to experience, but we might or probably will skip because history is contingent, is the notion of Putin doing a low threshold test of Article 5. Now, we haven't seen tests of Article 5 in what we noticed in Poland and what we've just noticed in Estonia, the MiG-25s entering Estonian airspace for 12 minutes or whatever that was. So the point is, you've got to think about this politically. The aim is not to gain some kind of military advantage over us, but to expose the futility of our alliances, the impotence of our capacity to act on the global stage, and thereby further undermine trust in our democracy. So ungovernability domestically in the West is what Putin is after. And then if there is a geopolitical aspiration there, it's to sort of get Western Europe to clear out of Eastern Europe and get the United States to clear out of Eastern Europe, even more importantly. NATO has no business in Eastern Europe for Putin. Eastern Europe doesn't belong to Russia, in Putin's view. It's just that it doesn't belong to the West either. And for him, NATO presence in these countries is a form of a sort of intolerable and inappropriate and counterproductive even for the US extension of US imperialism. That's how he sees it. And so these countries for Putin don't have real sovereignty. They have toy sovereignty. Now, Poles and Estonians would be very unimpressed to hear that, but that's how he feels. And so it doesn't mean they need to be controlled by Russia or they need to be part of Russia, but they need to be more in Russia's sphere of influence than in the West's. Putin's main motivation here is not actually foreign policy based, it's domestic, and that's regime security at home. I think that that's primary, and only secondary is there a certain kind of somewhat mystical escalatory aspiration about propelling Russia from the back row to the front row of nations and undermining the West's position in the world. That's the broader context. The specific incidents we're seeing in Poland and Estonia are okay to describe as tests, but I actually think they are in of themselves effective actions, because what Putin is doing is challenging us in a way that the key point isn't the challenge, but us not doing anything afterwards. Mm-hmm. Us not doing anything afterwards undermines us. And Putin knows that. And so he will carry on doing this. And his aspiration is to avoid a significant response from us. His aspiration is to keep exposing us in a way that actually undermines our domestic polities. So he is currently sort of in the process of beginning to bleed out whatever is left of Article 5, which I would argue is a lot less than most people think. The United States will not fight for the Baltics 2 or 3 years from now. That's just not going to happen. There are all kinds of very strong arguments made about how the Baltics are fairly well protected against the possible Russian invasion. They're quite persuasive arguments. The problem with them is that they misunderstand how little Putin needs to do and how political his motives are. So simply striking some kind of British contingent of troops in Estonia without any casualties, it could already be an effective way of undermining Article 5. So Putin's trajectory toward a possible conflict with us is absolutely based on the idea that he must avoid any kind of full-scale confrontation with NATO. He is not after that. But he's after the idea that we can be undermined domestically by exposing our impotence on the foreign stage. So far, Poland, I think, has worked. I think Estonia will probably work too. There's a lot of people who feel that, it's important to point out how these things have backfired for Putin. But these are sort of self-soothing, wishful thinking narratives that do very well on YouTube. You get you a couple of million views, but it's not true. What Putin did in Poland helped him. What Putin's just done, if I understand it correctly, or the kind of thing that I think is just done, is also going to help him. He's going to keep doing that, and every time we end up coming out weaker. And there's a direct link between our impotence being exposed on the foreign stage and us actually voting domestically for irresponsible anti-democratic candidates, because it just looks like our whole political system is unserious. It just looks like nothing works. So you might as well begin contemplating getting rid of it. So and much the same aim, of course, is the aim Putin has in Ukraine. His aim is ungovernability. When he bombards Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, he is not trying to kill 17 Ukrainians in Kiev. What he's trying to do is terrorize the population into giving up on trusting their government. And hopefully for him, he thinks destabilization in Ukraine will follow. Well, much the same aspiration in the West. But we've got to be careful not to confuse this with the notion that Russian interference is causing our democratic decline. Yes, our democratic decline is Putin's key theory of victory, but it's not the case that Putin is causing our democratic decline. We've got to keep these two things apart.
Yeah, I mean, I think we did a good job covering some of the reasons how our decline is self-inflicted earlier in the conversation. Now, you said that Putin doesn't want to own Eastern Europe, but on the specific question of Ukraine, right? I mean, I think you've described Putin's view of Ukrainians as like confused Russians. So I'm not. So does that same principle apply there in terms of like how Putin views his sort of ultimate goal vis-a-vis Ukraine?
The central goal in Ukraine is to use Ukraine as a lever to destabilize the West. Ukrainian goals in Ukraine for Putin are important, but they're secondary to that. What are they then, being secondary but important? They are to bring it about that Ukraine trends toward being something like what Georgia is today. Putin is uninterested in even territorial control over let's say we offer Putin territorial control of Ukraine up until the capital Kiev, and then some western parts of Ukraine can be an independent country. A utterly catastrophic, toxic nightmare scenario for Europe and for Ukraine. Putin wouldn't be keen on that. He'd much prefer to just exercise political control over what happens in Ukraine. The scenario he most of all wants to avoid is that when his regime gets rocky, that Ukraine is a moderately democratic and independent country next door. That for Putin is completely unacceptable and constitutes a kind of threat not just to his regime, but to his life in his mind. So for him, the very existence of Ukraine as a fairly independent, moderately democratic country, even outside of Western alliances, still constitutes a threat that, in my analysis, triggers in him a kind of Gaddafi-type trauma. This country being free on my border could make the difference between me having a Gaddafi fate and me not having a Gaddafi fate. So it's genuinely, in Putin's mind, a defensive war and an existential defensive war, where to some extent even his physical survival is at stake, which is why Trump's delusions about talking Vladimir a better agreement are so frivolous. They don't conceptualize how serious Putin is about Ukraine, and how important it is to him that Ukraine struggles politically, that Ukraine is unstable, that Ukraine is not properly governable, and he will continue to push as long as he thinks that pushing gets him closer to that outcome.
Yeah, and so as on a matter of like precision, right, on the conversation around like the cause of the war, there's sort of a prominent view that's associated, with what's often referred to as like the foreign policy realist perspective, embodied by commentators like John Mearsheimer, and sort of maybe and also by Silicon Valley venture capitalist, now member of the Trump administration, David Sachs, that states that the principal cause of this war was westward expansion by NATO. You mentioned earlier in this segment of our conversation that obviously Putin would like to see a withdrawal of NATO from Eastern Europe. But like, I mean, my understanding though is like from following you over the last few years, you don't actually like share that that's actually the principal cause of this war. NATO expansion is certainly something that Putin doesn't want. He doesn't like having the Baltic states and NATO off of his border, but the notion that if NATO wasn't a factor, that somehow would have saved Ukraine its fate. That does, like, based even on what you've already said, that doesn't seem to be true, in terms of like thinking about the actual root causes of the war.
The problem with the mode of realism of John Mearsheimer, who is a rational actor and makes his arguments in a constructive way, is that it has no space for a complex account of domestic causes of war. For Mearsheimer, the war has to be caused by some kind of national security interest. We can debate what it might be, but it's got to be a national security interest that's caused the war. I think that this is difficult if we turn to basically any serious country expert you can think of on Russia, because they're all going to tell you about the importance of regime security rather than national security as a driver of war. I mean, to get a little bit more granular, it's my assessment, which I won't make the argument for it, is that coming up to 2022, Putin was losing power within the regime relative to other members of the regime. What he was doing was outsourcing power, outsourcing presidential power unconstitutionally and probably illegally to people around him, watching them engage in conflict about how to deploy that power, and then arbitrating that conflict as a kind of referee. Eventually, his refereeing powers began to diminish, and a foreign conflict was a way of reconcentrating power in his hands. The trouble was that as he reconcentrated power in his hands, he made his grasp over that power more fragile than it was in the past. And we witnessed the consequences of that with the Prigozhin mutiny. But the point is, I think you're not actually being explanatorily serious unless you have the kind of conversation that the kind of remark I've just made is going to take you into. So you've got to start with regime security as a cause of war. Then secondly, when you move to what people might call Russian imperialist aggression, you have to point out that Putin has a problem with Ukraine, even if it's outside of any Western alliance. He genuinely has a problem with an independent and democratic Ukraine. And I not only think that he thinks that it poses a threat to him sincerely, I also believe that he could be right about it. When his regime is rocky, an independent Ukraine on Russia's borders could exert a deleterious influence from his point of view and swing things one way rather than another. And so he thinks that it's a threat. And so he is engaged in what for him is a defensive, regime preserving, life preserving, power preserving, but life preserving war against an independent Ukraine. Now, there is something else that's worth saying, and that's that for Putin, a non-Russian influenced Ukraine just is an American-controlled Ukraine. So for Putin, a democratic Ukraine outside of NATO and outside of the European Union is still a bizarre consequence of inappropriate projection of US imperial power. So that's what I mean when I say independent democratic Ukraine in Putin's terms. But nevertheless, this is unacceptable to him. So first, there's a regime security reason for what it's got nothing to do with national security issues. Secondly, Putin's imperial aggression is activated by the mere independence of Ukraine, no matter what alliances it's part of. But then thirdly, we have to be grown-ups, especially if we're going to stop being politically inept resistance liberals, and admit that there's complexity in the world and that we can keep two things in mind at the same time. And then what we can say is that the way NATO expansion was handled is absolutely part of the causes of war. You would need to be a lunatic to reduce that to zero, just as you would need to be highly irrational to put that at 100. But it's some kind of factor. Let's just do sort of a little bit of existential imaginative self-extraction and put ourselves in the position of the Russians. The Cold War is over. What's your basic enemy alliance? It's NATO. Has NATO disbanded? No. What's its historic purpose? To oppose you. Is it a military alliance? Yes. Is it coming closer to your border? Yes. Therefore, no democratic Russian government, even more democratic than Yeltsin ever was, would be able to treat NATO expansion as anything other than a national security threat. If you think that it's not a threat, you just are not. You engage in magical thinking about foreign politics. It's a relatively minor threat compared to the kind of threat Putin thinks it is, and the fact that it's a threat to Russia doesn't mean we don't do it, because after all, these countries wanted to join us, and that's a very strong reason for taking them. I think that the best way of talking about this is not actually to talk in terms of whether NATO expansion should have been done or shouldn't have been done, but how it was done. And here the work of Mary Surratt, I think, is very important. And she retraces in her recent work all the steps and missteps that occurred. And here I don't just mean bullshit promises to Ukraine to be in NATO, which are very dangerous if you're not going to follow through on them. But actually, more importantly, an alternately constructed NATO whereby there are tiers of membership. And so what Mary Surratt makes the case for is that Ukraine could have been brought on board via a partnership for peace kind of model that the Clinton administration earlier on was keen on, and then partly for domestic reasons had to give up. And if that had happened, there may have been a way of bringing Ukraine into a Western alliance, but not in the primary tier of it, which would have sort of probably balanced things in a way that allowed us to do it without excessively provoking a response from the Russians. There could have been cleverer ways to protect Ukraine from Russian aggression, and that can be a byproduct of a long conversation, which we can't have. I'm just giving cartoonish sort of talking points here about how we could have done NATO expansion differently. But the idea that the way we did it has zero causal consequence is just a kind of depoliticized magical thinking. It's just you not taking responsibility. And as I like to say, if you don't take responsibility, you're going to lose to the Russians on the international stage, and you're going to lose to the authoritarians at home. So I think that this is genuinely a let's say third, fourth place factor that we need to talk about, the denial of which is not a good idea. It's often denied in sort of pro-Ukraine activism. There's no point in it, because you can both admit it and say that's not what it's primarily about. And that's about just a complexity of economy of thought. The key reasons for war are A, regime security, and B, an incapacity to tolerate on part of the Putin regime an independent Ukraine, whether it's in NATO or not. And I suppose one final remark would be that it's worth asking not just whether Putin is against NATO's expansion, but whether he is against NATO existence in some sense. So that's also a helpful distinction. So I would say we're talking about a significant but non-primary factor there.
Yes. So I mean the thing that I think about here, taking on board everything you've said, is, I mean, really, I guess, like, in terms of the two prevalent schools of thought around how, liberal democracies sort of think about their disposition in terms of, like, their alliance strategies and their foreign policy and disposition towards authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, is like one of these schools of thought is sort of the liberal internationalist view, and then you have the realist view that we sort of like referred to earlier. And one of the things that like really worries me is, especially like in American political discourse, is that this more isolationist realist view seems to there seems to be in the zeitgeist and in the milieu that it's actually like a vindicated view of sorts. And that like really worries me, because while I certainly am sympathetic to the critique of U.S. foreign policy, in the Cold War era, and obviously and up into the 21st century, the Iraq War, and America's sort of imperial, the American imperialism as it's described. It seems to me that liberal democracies should want to promote liberal democracy at some level around the world, rather than simply sitting back and allowing China, in this case, like we're seeing happen in Africa, go in, buy off politicians, and slowly, slowly like rob those struggling nascent democracies of their democratic potential going forward. I'm worried about like this sense that there's something immoral about wanting to promote democracy and expand democracy around the world, and that it's characterized sometimes, including by parts of the left, as an imperialist tendency. And the sort of the liberal humanist in me like struggles with that sort of characterization of that. And so like kind of like thinking forward around sort of the the foreign policy that we should want. It seems to me that it's actually a dangerous notion to retreat towards this sort of like amorality in the foreign policy sphere.
So I think there's a realistic and there's a kind of a normatively abstract answer here. The normatively abstract answer here is that as much as people worry about the risk of imperialism when we project liberal values into China, there's also the risk of a kind of imperial attitude in doing the opposite, namely that you think that the Chinese people like authoritarianism because they're Chinese. So normatively speaking, in abstraction from the crisis of democracy in the West, we can say that Chinese people do not like to end up in courts which are going to be arbitrary. Chinese people do not like arbitrary arrest. Chinese people do not like to be stopped from saying what they think because, roughly speaking, they're human beings in the modern world. I don't want to say that liberalism has a universal normative reach. As it happens, it's not my view. I'm not a liberal universalist. But I think that in the modern world, there's a special level of reflectiveness and historical self-consciousness, which means that under moderately idealized conditions, people want a degree of space to decide their values for themselves and a degree of individual space to exercise their authenticity. I'm not saying that was true 600 years ago, but I think that it's tendentiously true in the modern world. So no, there is no human culture for which the type of government that China has is perfect or ideal. There is no human culture today for which dictatorship is an ideal form of government. And so you might say, well, to how much of the world does liberalism apply then? And the answer has to be kind of invitational. It applies to as much of the world as it applies to. And with every kind of revolt or every kind of critique of the government in an authoritarian state, questions about the legitimacy of local arrangements have been asked, and the possibility for something that might look like a more liberal alternative has been politically put on the table. And it's no longer us imposing it there. It's simply conflict, domestic conflict in that particular polity, in that particular culture. So let's not bullshit ourselves about there being populations on Earth who want corrupt courts, populations on Earth who want delusional kleptocratic maniacs to run their polities. That's not good for anybody. We can say that. But this is sort of the normative abstraction, how you and I might ethically relate to what's going on in other countries. At the political level, you have to say that what we should ask of the West has to be relative to its capacity. And currently, the subject of the day for us is not how do we project democracy globally, but how do we keep it at home, and how do we bring it about that our foreign policy undermines our enemies' capacity to put us in a position whereby we're further democratically undermined at home. I think that's really the key aspiration. It's not about spreading democracy. It's about bringing it about that machinations the Russo-Chinese alliance might engage in on European territory are not going to further undermine us. But this is difficult because it's easy to say in response to the Russians testing us in Poland or in the Baltics, let's respond strongly. But to respond strongly, that response needs to be part of a strategy. And for us to have a strategy, we need to have strong enough democracies at home to sustain governments that are able to act with that degree of vision and discipline on the foreign stage without also being punished by domestic populations for it. So this is difficult. We have to talk about this relative to capacity. That's why I'm skeptical about all of these self-congratulatory remarks. Let's arm Ukraine properly. Let's send in our own troops into Ukraine. Well, yes, you can do that, but you need a strategy first. What are you trying to get out of this conflict? What are your aims? How do you want this to land? What do you want to actually happen on the ex-Soviet space? And we are too democratically weak at the moment to conceptualize a coherent vision for where our foreign policy needs to go. That's why we're seeing Europeans in a ludicrous situation of disjointedness between what they say and what they do. European language is much more pro-Ukrainian than the degree of European commitment shows in practice. And that's why we've got a president of the United States who's kind of keen on Netanyahu not doing what he's doing, and is kind of keen on Putin not doing what he's doing. Not deeply committed to stopping them, but kind of keen on that they would be good if they stop. We can't do anything about it. Can't do anything about it at all. So this is difficult because what we ask of ourselves has to be relative to our capacity. And that's why I think the causal story runs democracy first, foreign policy second. If you read military experts, if you read sort of war commentators, it's often a message that is ventilated about how the West needs to wake up. That's a delusion. The West needs to be democratically strong enough to develop a strategy to stand up to Putin. We don't have a strategy, and we're not democratically strong enough to develop one. That's the reality. That means that we're in a weak position. We can do better or worse within this position, and we should always advocate for doing better. That's why we need to be very intentional about how we balance things like greater military spending versus commitment to the welfare state at home in our democracies. But unfortunately, you don't get a strong foreign policy if your democracy is weak. Putin knows that, and he is exploiting it. We need to be much more strategic about this, but we can't just engage in magical thinking that pretends that our democracies are what they were 20 years ago, and therefore advocates that we do things on the foreign stage that we can't get ourselves to do at the moment.
Well, Vlad, I mean, I have myself now run out of time, so I think that will have to be the
very good.
The end of our
by oxygen. We did almost 2 hours. There we go.
Wow. I mean, I mean, this was like a wide-ranging discussion, and I'd love all of my. I mean, I love this chat, and everyone should check out Vlad. He has 2 YouTube channels. He's got his Vlad Vexler main channel, and also that Vlad Vexler chat. And I am a voracious consumer of Vlad's content. I think he always adds amazing color and perspective to a lot of the things that are happening in our world. And
well, let me thank you for welcoming me onto Substack, where your work is based, and where I'm a newbie and just finding my way. So thank you very much for platforming me and helping me learn a little bit about this platform that has been an important home for you for quite a while now.
Thank you so much, Vlad, and I look forward to many future discussions.
Indeed. Take care.
Take care, Vlad. Bye-bye.